At exactly 3:17 a.m., Eleanor Hayes was awakened by the sound of her phone ringing beside her bed. At 62 years old, she had learned that phone calls in the middle of the night rarely bring good news. Her first thought was that something had happened to someone she loved. Her second thought was that perhaps someone from church needed prayers. Never, not even for a moment, did she imagine that the voice waiting for her on the other side of the line belonged to the one person she had spent 22 years praying for. Her trembling fingers reached for the unfamiliar number glowing softly on her phone screen. Hello. Silence. Then she heard someone quietly crying on the other end of the line. Suddenly, her heart began racing for reasons she couldn't explain. And then came the one word she had waited 22 years to hear. Mom. 22 years had passed since she last heard that voice. 22 years since her 16-year-old son walked out of their front door and never came home. 22 years of prayers. 22 years of waiting. 22 years of leaving the porch light on every Christmas Eve. What happened next would become the answer to a prayer Eleanor had faithfully prayed every single day for more than 2 decades. Because sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive quickly. Sometimes, they arrive 22 years later. Caleb Hayes wasn't always the son who disappeared for 22 years. Once upon a time, he was simply a 16-year-old boy who loved fishing trips with his father on Saturday mornings and never missed his mother's homemade pancakes before church on Sundays. After 7 difficult years of waiting for a child, God blessed Samuel and Eleanor Hayes with their miracle son. To them, Caleb wasn't merely an answered prayer. He was God's faithfulness wrapped in tiny fingers and whispered prayers. Their home wasn't perfect, but it was filled with laughter, grace, and the kind of love that made people linger a little longer after Sunday lunches. Life was beautiful, until it wasn't. When Caleb turned 16, Samuel's construction business unexpectedly collapsed. Within months, contracts disappeared, bills began piling up, and the future they had carefully planned suddenly became uncertain. Caleb watched his father slowly become someone he no longer understood. The laughter around their dinner table became quieter. Family conversations became shorter. The father who never missed his basketball games suddenly spent late nights sitting alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and unanswered questions. What Caleb couldn't see was that Samuel was carrying far more than financial burdens. He was carrying shame, unknown to his family. Samuel had begun quietly selling many of his treasured possessions simply to keep food on their table. But he never complained. Instead, he smiled and carried his fears silently. Caleb didn't understand any of this. He simply saw disappointment replacing the life they once knew. Then came one Thursday evening that changed everything. What began as an ordinary disagreement about money quickly became years of fear and frustration, finally finding their voice. Do you even care what's happening to this family anymore? Caleb shouted. Samuel quietly replied, Son, I've been trying my best. Those 7 words should have ended the conversation. Instead, they became the beginning of 22 years of silence. Your best wasn't good enough. Tears immediately filled Eleanor's eyes as she pleaded with him to calm down. But 16-year-old hearts often speak from pain before wisdom arrives. And then Caleb said the words he would spend 22 years wishing he could take back. I wish I had never been born into this family. Without another word, he grabbed his backpack and walked toward the front door. Caleb, please don't do this, Eleanor cried. He stopped briefly but never turned around. None of them realized they were looking at one another for the very last time in 22 years. He thought he was leaving for one night. He was wrong. Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself waiting on God's timing for something that seemed impossible? Let us know where you're watching from and what you're trusting God for in this season of your life. We read every comment and would love to pray with you. And if you're enjoying today's story, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Faith and Grace and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of God's faithfulness, redemption, and grace. Little did Caleb know that 22 years later, he would give anything to hear his father's voice one more time. Nor did he know that somewhere in God's perfect timing, grace was already writing the next chapter of his story. Caleb never intended to leave home for 22 years. He intended to leave for one night, perhaps a week at most. He simply needed time to breathe, time to think, and time to escape the overwhelming emotions he didn't know how to put into words. At 16 years old, 22 years might as well have been forever. He couldn't imagine missing 22 Christmases, 22 birthdays, or 22 Mother's Days. Most of all, he couldn't imagine that one argument would become 22 years of silence. Back at home, Eleanor sat beside the front door long after midnight, waiting for the sound of footsteps returning home. "He's angry," she whispered softly to Samuel. "But he'll come home." Samuel smiled gently before replying. "Yes, sweetheart. He'll come home." Neither of them slept that night. Every passing car caused Eleanor to sit upright, with hope filling her heart. Every sound outside made her believe her miracle was walking back through the front door. Morning came. Caleb didn't. Then another day passed. Then another. Finally, 12 days later, they received their first phone call. Caleb was safe. He was staying with a friend's family several states away. Tears immediately filled Eleanor's eyes the moment she heard his voice. "Baby, please come home." Silence followed. "I'm not ready, Mom." "Then we'll come to you." "No, Mom. We'll work through this together." Another silence. "I have to go." The call ended less than a minute later. Over the following months, Caleb called home only 3 times. Each conversation became shorter than the one before, until finally, the call stopped altogether. Then came the letter. Eleanor spent almost 6 months writing and rewriting every word before finally sending it to him. Inside were photographs from his childhood, handwritten scriptures she had prayed over him, and one sentence she desperately needed him to believe. "No matter how far you run, there will always be a light on for you here." Weeks later, the envelope returned unopened. Stamped across the front were 4 words that shattered her heart. "Return to sender." That day, Eleanor quietly walked into Caleb's bedroom, sat beside his empty bed, and prayed a different prayer. "Lord, I don't care whether it takes 5 years or 50 years. Bring my son safely back to you. And if you choose, bring him home too." Unknown to Eleanor, God had already begun answering that prayer. She simply hadn't reached the chapter where she would see it. Time has a way of changing almost everything. Black hair becomes gray. Children become adults. Seasons change. But some things never changed inside the Hayes family. Every Christmas Eve, Eleanor left the porch light on. Every Christmas Eve, she prepared Caleb's favorite meal. Every Christmas Eve, she placed an extra plate at the dinner table. Not because she knew he was coming home, but because she knew God wasn't finished writing his story. Somewhere around the 10th year, people stopped asking whether Caleb was coming home. Somewhere around the 15th year, they quietly assumed Eleanor had finally moved on. They were wrong. Moving forward and giving up are not the same thing. Eleanor continued serving faithfully at church. She laughed again. She smiled again. She lived her life fully while continuing to pray faithfully. She simply refused to stop believing God. Every birthday, she carefully wrapped a present and placed it inside a wooden chest waiting patiently in the corner of Caleb's bedroom. Every birthday, 22 gifts, 22 letters, 22 years of prayers. Samuel would often laugh softly and say, "At this point, our son is going to need a moving truck just to take his birthday presents home." Eleanor would smile before replying, "Then we'll rent him one." But beneath her laughter was a prayer she had faithfully prayed every single day for 22 years. "Lord, don't just bring my son home. Bring him home to you." One Sunday morning, Pastor Benjamin Cole preached a message Eleanor would never forget. Do not allow time to become greater than God's promises. Then he continued, "There is someone sitting here this morning who has almost stopped praying because you've been waiting too long. Today, God sent me to remind you that he is never late. He is always working, even when we cannot see him working." Tears quietly rolled down Eleanor's face as she whispered, "Even if it takes 22 years, Lord, I'll still thank you." Little did she know, somewhere hundreds of miles away, God was preparing her son's heart for the journey home. 22 years can change almost everything about a person's life. The angry 16-year-old boy who walked away from home had become a successful 38-year-old man. Caleb owned his own consulting business, lived comfortably, and had accomplished many of the things he once dreamed about. By every worldly standard, he was doing well. By every spiritual standard, however, something was still missing. Success had given him many things. It simply couldn't give him peace. There were no family photographs hanging on his walls. No Christmas dinners shared with loved ones. No stories of childhood retold around the dinner table. Just success quietly sharing a home with loneliness. Sometimes late at night, He found himself wondering whether his mother still made apple pie at Christmas or whether his father still enjoyed fishing on Saturday mornings. Then he would quickly push those thoughts away. Shame has a dangerous way of convincing us that we've gone too far to come home. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 22. Suddenly, 22 years had passed. Caleb wasn't afraid his parents would reject him. He was afraid they wouldn't. He didn't believe he deserved forgiveness anymore. Unknown to him, forgiveness had been waiting patiently for him at home for 22 years. More importantly, God's grace had never stopped pursuing him. There were moments throughout those 22 years when God gently reminded him of home. A worship song playing unexpectedly inside a grocery store. A Bible verse spoken during a business conference. A stranger promising to pray for him during a particularly difficult season of life. Looking back now, Caleb would later realize God had been speaking to him all along. He simply wasn't ready to listen. Then came one rainy Tuesday evening that changed everything. His flight was unexpectedly delayed in Nashville because of severe weather conditions, leaving him stranded inside a small airport terminal. Frustrated and exhausted, he wandered quietly into the only coffee shop still open. Sitting beside him was an elderly gentleman reading his Bible. Caleb smiled politely before ordering his coffee. 30 minutes later, he would find himself having one of the most important conversations of his entire life. There was something strangely comforting about speaking honestly to a complete stranger. Perhaps it was because strangers don't know who we used to be. They simply meet us where we are. The elderly gentleman smiled warmly before asking, "Long day?" Caleb laughed softly. "More like a long 22 years. The gentleman smiled, but said nothing. There was no judgment in his eyes, only kindness. Almost an hour passed before Caleb realized he had shared more of his story than he had with anyone in decades. "I left home 22 years ago," he confessed quietly. "Have you gone back?" the gentleman asked. "No." "Why not?" Caleb smiled sadly before replying. "Because I'm not 16 anymore. I'm 38 years old now. It's too late." The elderly gentleman slowly closed his Bible before asking one simple question. "Too late for whom?" Caleb sat silently. "Too late for your parents? Too late for forgiveness? Or too late for God?" Tears immediately began filling Caleb's eyes. Before he could answer, the gentleman opened his Bible to Luke chapter 15 and quietly slid it across the table toward him. "Do you know what my favorite part of the story of the prodigal son is?" he asked. Caleb gently shook his head. "It isn't that the son came home. It's that the father never stopped waiting." Silence filled the space between them. "Do you know why the father saw his son while he was still a long way off?" "No," Caleb quietly replied. "Because he never stopped looking down the road." Caleb lowered his eyes as tears quietly rolled down his face. Then came the question that would change everything. What if they're still waiting for you? 22 years of guilt suddenly met one impossible thought. What if they're still waiting? For the first time in 22 years, Caleb allowed himself to believe that perhaps his story wasn't over after all. That evening, before leaving the coffee shop, the elderly gentleman smiled warmly and said, "Son, there is nowhere you can run that God's grace cannot find you. If he has spent 22 years pursuing your heart, perhaps it's time to stop running." Those words stayed with Caleb long after the conversation had ended. Later that night, sitting alone inside his hotel room, he did something he hadn't done since he was 16 years old. He got down on his knees and prayed. Through tears, he whispered, "Lord, I don't know whether I deserve another chance. I don't know whether they'll forgive me, but I'm tired of running." He paused briefly before continuing. "If you can still have me after 22 years, I'm ready to come home." That night, 22 years of running finally came to an end. Unknown to Caleb, 22 years earlier, his mother had already begun praying for that exact moment. And somewhere in Franklin, Tennessee, a porch light was still waiting for him. There are some prayers God answers immediately. Others are answered one day, 1 month, or 1 year later. Then there are prayers that require us to trust Him long enough to witness a miracle we could never have imagined for ourselves. 22 years earlier, Eleanor had prayed a dangerous prayer. "Lord, don't just bring my son home. Bring him back to you." Looking back now, she would realize God had been answering that prayer every single day for 22 years. Caleb spent the next few weeks wrestling with his decision. He had finally stopped running from God, but there was one mountain left to climb, calling home. How do you apologize for 22 years? How do you explain 22 missed birthdays? 22 Christmases? 22 Mother's Days? 22 years of silence. The truth was, he couldn't. Some things cannot be explained away. They can only be surrendered to grace. One sleepless night, Caleb found himself sitting quietly inside his living room, holding the last photograph ever taken of the three of them together. He was 16 years old in the picture, smiling proudly between his parents while holding his birthday cake. 22 years had passed, yet somehow, his mother still looked exactly the same inside his memories. Tears quietly rolled down his face as he whispered, "I've wasted so much time." He looked toward the clock sitting beside him. 3:16 a.m. Suddenly, he remembered something Pastor Benjamin had once preached when he was still a little boy. There is never a wrong time to obey God. Through tears, Caleb smiled softly before replying, "I guess 3 in the morning will have to do." His trembling fingers reached for the small notebook that had traveled with him for more than 20 years. Written neatly across one of its pages was his mother's phone number. Amazingly, she had never changed it. He stared at those 10 digits for almost 5 minutes. 22 years had brought him to this moment. Finally, he pressed the call button. Every excuse that had kept him away suddenly came rushing back. What if she doesn't answer? What if she's angry? What if it's too late? What if she doesn't want to hear my voice anymore? Then another thought quietly entered his heart. What if she's been waiting all this time? Thousands of miles away, Eleanor Hayes was sleeping peacefully beside her husband when her phone suddenly began ringing. 3:17 a.m. Half asleep, she frowned slightly at the unfamiliar number appearing on her screen. Samuel quietly opened his eyes. "Who is it?" "I don't know," she smiled sleepily. "At 3 in the morning?" Apparently so. She almost allowed it to ring unanswered before deciding otherwise. "Hello." Silence. Then she heard someone quietly crying on the other end of the line. Suddenly, her heart began racing for reasons she couldn't explain. There are some voices a mother never forgets. Not after 22 days. Certainly not after 22 years. And then came the word she had faithfully prayed 22 years to hear again. "Mom." Time stood still. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Caleb." She could barely speak. Samuel immediately sat upright beside her. "Eleanor? What's wrong?" Through tears and trembling hands, she smiled at him before whispering, "It's our boy." 22 years disappeared in a single moment. 22 years earlier, Eleanor Hayes had prayed, "Lord, don't just bring my son home. Bring him back to you." Looking back now, she would realize that God had been answering that prayer every single day for 22 years. There are moments in life when heaven quietly brings together prayers, tears, and God's perfect timing. This was one of those moments. Caleb could no longer stop crying. "Mom, I don't know if I deserve to call you that anymore." Eleanor immediately replied through tears, "Baby, you've never stopped being my son." 22 years of guilt suddenly met 22 years of grace. For several moments, neither of them spoke. There simply weren't enough words in the world to fill 22 years of silence. Then Caleb quietly continued, "Mom, I didn't call to ask whether I could come home." Her heart immediately sank. "I called because before I come home, there's something more important I need you to know. 22 years ago, I ran away from this family. Tonight, I stopped running from God." Eleanor immediately covered her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. "Mom, I gave my life back to Jesus." She began sobbing uncontrollably. "For 22 years, I blamed everyone but myself. I blamed Dad. I blamed my circumstances. I even blamed God. But tonight, I finally understand something you tried to teach me when I was little. God's grace never stopped looking for me." Caleb paused briefly before continuing. "Mom, I've spent 22 years believing I had gone too far to come home. I thought I had missed too much. I thought I had broken too much. I thought God could forgive everyone except me. I was wrong." Eleanor sat quietly weeping beside Samuel as she listened to the miracle she had faithfully prayed for finally unfolding before her ears. Then came the words that left her completely undone. "Mom, I need you to know something. I've carried that night with me every single day for 22 years. There hasn't been a birthday that I didn't think about you. There hasn't been a Christmas that I didn't wonder whether you were sitting at the dinner table missing me. And there hasn't been a single day that I haven't wished I could take back the words I spoke before I left." Tears quietly rolled down his face. "I spent 22 years waiting because I was ashamed. Then I realized something tonight. I've been waiting 22 years for a punishment that never came." Eleanor smiled softly through her tears. "Oh, "Sweetheart," she whispered, "there was never going to be a punishment waiting for you here. Only love." For several moments, neither of them could speak. Then Caleb asked the question he had been afraid to ask for 22 years. "Mom, can I come home?" Eleanor smiled through tears before replying with the words heaven had been waiting 22 years to hear. "Baby, we've been waiting 22 years to answer that question." Samuel quietly leaned toward the phone before speaking for the first time. "Son." Caleb immediately broke down, crying the moment he heard his father's voice. "Dad, welcome home, Caleb." Those 3 words healed wounds that 22 years could not. Unknown to Caleb, however, there was something waiting for him at home that would become one of the greatest reminders of God's faithfulness he had ever received. 22 birthday presents. 22 handwritten letters. 22 years of prayers waiting patiently inside a wooden chest in the corner of his childhood bedroom. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all, the porch light had never been turned off. 3 days later, Caleb found himself driving down the same street he had walked away from 22 years earlier. Everything felt strangely familiar. The beautiful maple tree he had planted with his father when he was 8 years old now stood taller than the house itself. The neighboring homes had changed over the years. Children he once played with had long since grown up and moved away. Time had changed many things. But somehow, home still felt like home. Then he saw it. The porch light was still on. Tears immediately filled his eyes. 22 years. 22 Christmases. 22 years of prayers. And somehow, the light was still waiting for him. For several moments, Caleb simply sat quietly inside his car, unable to move. He wasn't afraid they wouldn't forgive him anymore. He was overwhelmed because they already had. Finally, he slowly made his way toward the front door. Before he could knock, it quietly opened. Eleanor had been standing beside the living room window for almost an hour waiting for her miracle to walk through the front gate. Samuel smiled softly as he looked toward his wife. "He's here." 22 years earlier, she had watched her 16-year-old son walk away carrying anger and heartbreak. Today, she was watching a 38-year-old man walk home carrying grace instead. Neither of them spoke at first. Caleb simply stood there looking at his mother as tears quietly rolled down his face. Time had placed gentle wrinkles around her eyes and silver among her beautiful dark hair, but somehow she was still exactly the mother he remembered. Then, through tears, he quietly whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry." Eleanor smiled before immediately pulling him tightly into her arms. "Baby, you're home." There were no questions, no accusations, no lectures about 22 years. Just grace. Samuel quietly wrapped his arms around both of them before softly saying, "Welcome home, son." At that moment, Caleb realized something he had misunderstood for 22 years. Love had never been waiting for an explanation. It had simply been waiting for his return. Later that evening, Eleanor quietly excused herself before returning with an old wooden chest Caleb had never seen before. "There's something I've been waiting 22 years to give you," she smiled. Caleb carefully opened the wooden chest before immediately breaking down in tears. Inside were 22 beautifully wrapped birthday presents, 22 handwritten letters, 22 years of prayers. "Mom," Eleanor smiled softly through tears, "I promised God 22 years ago that if he ever brought you home, I would make sure you knew that you had never spent a single birthday forgotten." Caleb could barely speak. "You bought me presents every year?" "Every year. Even when I sent your letter back unopened?" "Especially then. Even when I didn't deserve it." Eleanor gently took his trembling hand before replying, "Caleb, that's what grace does." She then handed him the very first letter she had written 22 years earlier. Through tears, he slowly began reading. "Dear Caleb, tonight, I don't know where you are or when you'll come home. I don't know whether it will take 2 weeks or 20 years. But there are 3 things I know with absolute certainty. I love you. Your father loves you. And God loves you more than both of us combined. Wherever life takes you, please remember this. You are never too far away for grace to find you. I will leave the porch light on for as long as I have breath in my body. Love forever. Mom." By the time he reached the final line, tears had completely blurred the words before him. 22 years earlier, he thought he had left home carrying anger. What he didn't know was that his mother had remained home carrying hope. And perhaps that was one of God's greatest miracles of all. Sometimes we spend so much time asking God to change our circumstances that we forget he is equally interested in changing our hearts. 22 years earlier, Eleanor Hayes began praying what she thought was a simple prayer. Lord, bring my son home. Somewhere along the journey, however, God gently changed her prayer. It became, Lord, bring my son home to you. Looking back now, she realized God had answered neither prayer immediately because he intended to answer both of them perfectly. That evening, after dinner, Caleb sat quietly beside the wooden chest holding the final letter in his trembling hands. Unlike the others, this letter had only been written 3 months earlier. Eleanor smiled softly before saying, "That's the last one. You wrote it before I called?" Caleb asked quietly. "I did, but you didn't know I was coming home." Eleanor smiled warmly before replying, "No, sweetheart. I didn't know when you were coming home. I only knew God wasn't finished writing your story." Tears immediately filled his eyes once again. Slowly, he opened the envelope and began reading. Dear Caleb, if you're reading this letter today, then God has answered 22 years of prayers. Perhaps I've become an old woman by now. Perhaps you've become a husband, a father, or maybe you're still discovering who God created you to be. Whatever chapter of life you're living when this letter finally finds you, there is something I have wanted you to know every single day since you left home. I forgave you 22 years ago. Your father forgave you 22 years ago. More importantly, God never stopped loving you. Not for one moment. Caleb, I have never prayed that God would make you wealthy or successful. I have never asked him to give you everything you wanted. I have only ever asked him for 2 things, that he would bring you safely back to him, and that he would bring you home when the time was right. If it took 22 years for him to answer that prayer, then 22 years was worth waiting for. I need you to know something else. You have never been the prodigal son of this family. You have always been our son. Sons don't stop being sons because they make mistakes. And God's children don't stop being his because they lose their way. There is one final thing I have prayed over your life every single day since you were 16 years old. May you become the kind of man who never forgets what God's grace has done for him. If God has brought you home today, don't spend the rest of your life mourning the years you've lost. Spend it thanking him for the years he has graciously given back to you. Welcome home, sweetheart. I have been waiting for you. Love forever. Mom. By the time Caleb reached the final line of the letter, he could no longer hold back his tears. 22 years of guilt had finally met 22 years of grace. For the first time since he was 16 years old, he understood something his mother had known all along. God's delays are never God's denials. Sometimes, they are simply God's preparations. 22 years earlier, a frightened 16-year-old boy walked away believing he had destroyed everything he loved. 22 years later, a 38-year-old man returned home to discover that grace had been waiting patiently for him all along. Somewhere tonight, there is a mother praying for a prodigal child to come home. Somewhere tonight, there is someone carrying enough shame to believe they have gone too far from God to return. Somewhere tonight, there is a weary heart wondering whether God's promises have expired because too much time has passed. This story is your reminder that God's grace does not run out because the years have passed. No one is too broken, too lost, or too far gone for him to redeem. If God can faithfully carry a mother's prayer through 22 years of waiting, he can certainly carry yours too. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: the porch light of God's grace never goes out. Your story isn't over. He's still writing it. Perhaps today, you're praying for a prodigal child to come home. Perhaps you're waiting for God to restore something you thought was lost forever. Or perhaps you're the one who has spent years believing you've wandered too far from God to return. Wherever this story finds you today, may it remind you that God's grace never stops pursuing his children, and his promises never expire. We'd love to hear from you. What are you trusting God for in this season of your life? Share it with us in the comments below. Our Stories of Faith and Grace family would be honored to pray with you. And if today's story encouraged your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Faith and Grace and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of God's faithfulness, hope, redemption, and grace. Until next time, may God remind you that no matter how long you've been waiting, no matter how far you've wandered, and no matter how impossible your situation may seem, his grace is still reaching, his love is still pursuing, and your story is still being written. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next story. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29 verse 11.